Well, you were just the most relaxed audience ever. If we go back in our mind a couple of months in the teaching here, we'll remember that Revelation chapter 7 is an interlude. It's a literary interpolation. It's a parenthesis in the divine mind and in the human mind. And the way that we know that is because chapter 6 ends with the sixth seal. Remember, we went through seals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right in order. And then we're wanting to get to the seventh seal. And you go to chapter 8 and verse 1. And when he had opened the seventh seal. So there's the seventh seal. So chapter 7 is very obviously an interlude or a parenthesis. And so because it is used as a parenthesis, then we obviously are asking the question, why? What's up? Why is this out of order? And it is out of order. Why is it out of order? And I gave you some reasons that I won't go over several months ago, but I'll mention two of them. One of them is it's pretty obviously intended to answer what we thought was a rhetorical question at the end of chapter 6. For the great day of their wrath is come, and who will be able to stand? And we all answered back then, after reading the sixth seal, after reading this shaking in heaven and earth, and the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the mighty men, and every bondman, and every free man, they're running to the rocks and caves to hide and saying, fall on us and hide us from the face of the one who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. And then the chapter ends with this question, the great day of their wrath has come, and who will be able to stand? So we would say, well, no one. We just saw from chapter 6, no one would be able to stand. But thankfully, John has a very interesting answer, and that is, don't say that too quickly, because he gives us, here is a group, and this isn't exhaustive. That doesn't mean they're the only people who will survive, but at least these are some people, and it is the group of the sealed 144,000. So I think that's part of the reason that this is an interlude. And then a second reason that I said back then, which will bring us to where we need to be tonight, is that when you read the Old Testament and you look at this period of intense trouble that's going to hit the earth, that's characterized by some of the signs that we've already seen in chapter 6 and that we will see more of in the rest of the book. And then we see that period of intense distress is followed by some type of glorious time where the Israelites are back in their land and Jesus is on the throne in Jerusalem and the leopard is lying down with the lamb. We see some type of glorious kingdom and period on earth that is still to come. And according to the Old Testament prophets, because they are prophets of Israel, even though they prophesy against the nations, they are Israelites, all of them. Because they are prophets of Israel, they see this kingdom primarily with respect to their own nation. So in other words, what I'm saying is, since the book of Revelation is giving us kind of a step-by-step picture of the tribulation, of the millennium in chapter 20 that will follow, it's only reasonable that eventually in this book, we're going to come to the nation of Israel. It would be completely shocking and surprising, knowing the Old Testament prophets, knowing what they have to say about the Jewish nature of this period and of the millennium, that it all has to do with Jerusalem, the temple, and the land. If we would go through the New Testament's, magnum opus on this period and never have seen the nation of Israel. So they are brought into the picture right here. With the sealing of the 144,000, 12,000 from the 12 mentioned tribes. People have a big problem with these being descendants of Jacob or Israel. They somehow want to spiritualize that, want to make them Gentiles, want to make them Christians, want to do one thing or the other. And we were looking at some objections. And the last objection that we looked at, the third and last one last week, said this. And this is where I left off last week for those here, and this is where we'll pick up now. The third objection said this. When you look at verses 5, 6, 7, and 8, this is a list of 12 tribes of Israel. It does not look like the normal list that we read in the Old Testament. It does not look like the regular, standard, run-of-the-mill list that you'll find in the Old Testament. Consequently, because it doesn't look like the standard list, then that is a hint to us that something is amiss, and maybe we aren't to interpret this literally. That's coming through the window trying to figure out what can we do with the 144,000. And my response last time, which was very easy, we dismissed this pretty quickly, and then that's taking us on a new journey. My response last time was, in the Old Testament, there are almost 24 lists of the tribes, none of which look like any other one. So when you make a claim that, well, now this doesn't look like the Old Testament list, which list are you talking about? They're all different. There is no normal. There is no standard. They differ in the order, they differ in who they include, and they differ in who they exclude. Okay? They differ in their arrangement and inclusions and exclusions. And so if you will look at this piece of paper, which all of you have, this was just trying to put it visually in front of you so that it is easy to understand. And we went back and actually, I think everyone has this, and looked at the 12 sons of Jacob. There they are by their birth mother. Leah, then Rachel's handmaid, then Leah's handmaid, then Leah, and then Rachel. There's the 12 sons in chronological order. So we could say that's the first list. It's actually the list of the sons as they were born, although they're not tribes. They're just children. They're just sons that have been born in this order. And then if you go down to the bottom, you'll see 4 columns. And that kind of gives us the next 4 times where we see these 12 sons. And if you want to just, well, Jacob's prophecy is one. That's Genesis 49. And all I'm asking you to do as I talk for the next couple of minutes is just let your eyes scan back and forth. And you'll see that none of those are the same as any of the others. They're not the chronological order of their birth. Now, there are a lot of similarities, but there is no standard Old Testament list. That's the whole argument here. So when anyone says, in Revelation 7, that's not the standard list, all you have to say is there is no standard list. There are 18 to 20 different enumerations of the tribes, and none of them are identical. So that is simply a moot point, as we would say. It doesn't prove anything at all. The only thing, I guess, that it proves is the irregularity of the list. They say, well, it's not a regular list. There is no regular list. When you look at the list, a study of the 18 to 20 different times the lists are given simply demonstrate their irregularity with regard to order, with regard to inclusions, and with regard to exclusions. But that second column, if you would just in your Bible flip over to Exodus chapter 1, Joseph is already down in Egypt, and Joseph is the man that we're going to talk about tonight, by the way. We talked about Levi last time. Joseph is already down in Egypt, and his family comes to him, and you'll see a list of, they're not tribes, they're just family clans, because there's only 70 people total, the son, his wife, and however many children each of them have. And Moses, the author of Exodus 1, said 70 souls came into Egypt, and Joseph and his family, his wife and 2 sons, and whoever else was involved, were already down there. Exodus 1:2. And if I go too fast or you have a question, just stop me. Exodus 1:2. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. Now that's the order of birth so far. And that's kind of a regular order, although there are plenty of times they're not given in that order. But that's the order of birth of the first birth mother, Leah. Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob, whose name was, changed to Israel, were 70 souls. For Joseph was in Egypt already. So he is obviously excluded from this count of 70, and he's excluded from a list of the families. You'll probably, if you count them, you'll have 11, because his family was already in Egypt. Then one more reference to this, and then we're going to be through with this. Then your third and fourth column, we have moved a little bit in history. They have been delivered from Egypt. They have gone through the Exodus. Now they are out in the wilderness. They are getting ready to travel, preparation for travel. You see that list. And then in Numbers chapter 2, you see the fourth list, how they encamped around the tabernacle. Now, if you'll look carefully at those two lists, not only do we have a different arrangement again, but for the first time, we have an exclusion and inclusion. And that's what's important. And so what happened? Here's what happened. We have a loss of the tribe of Levi. And we talked all about that last week, so I'm not going to go into that. So we have a loss of the tribe of Levi. So now we have 11 tribes of Israel. And God wants that number 12 to be maintained. So we have a loss of the tribe of Levi. So what do? Well, we don't do anything. God did it for us. If you look in that third and fourth column, if you can look through all those names and process them quickly, you're going to see 2 new names. All the others stay the same, except Levi is now gone. We also have another one who is gone, but he's gone only in one sense, because he's going to be replaced. Also, if you look in that third and fourth list, Joseph is gone. So we have Joseph gone. So now we have 10 tribes. 10 tribes of Israel, and we need 12. And so what do we do about that? We bring in, and this is what we're going to look at tonight, we bring in the 2 sons of Joseph. Manasseh, who was the firstborn, and Ephraim, who was the younger brother. Look at this interesting verse with all of what I've just said in mind over in Psalm 77, verse 15. You've read it. If you've read Psalms, and you all have, you read the verse. And now this verse it'll take on a new meaning to you. And we're going to work our way through the Genesis narrative, looking at, we've already talked about Levi being dropped out, and Joseph is being dropped out so that the 2 sons of his can be pulled in. We're going to look at how all of that happens and where it's found in Genesis. But look at this interesting verse in Psalm 77:15. Thou hast with thine arm redeemed thy people, the sons of Jacob, the sons of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, the sons of Jacob and Joseph. How about that? Because the writer here knows that Levi has been dropped out, and he knows that Joseph has been dropped out, but he's got the sons of Joseph in. So it's a reference to the 12 tribes, which then became a new version of the 12 tribes, with Levi and Joseph gone, and Manasseh and Ephraim brought in. That makes sense so far?
Why is Joseph out?
Joseph is out. Well, that's where we're headed next. He could have left Joseph in, so we have 11 tribes. Where are you going to get that 12th tribe? Where he gets the 12th tribe is by giving a double blessing to Joseph. So he has to take Joseph out, only in a sense. Joseph is still represented, but he's represented in the persons of his 2 sons.
Just like Jacob's represented
in the persons of his 12 sons.
12 and their children.
That's right. So if you'll flip back now to the book of Genesis, in Genesis 41, verses 50 and 52, we see the birth of Joseph's 2 sons. And while you're turning there, and we got several passages to look at here in Genesis. You know, Genesis, it's 50 chapters long. It's, you know how it begins. In the beginning, think of the amount of history that's in the book of Genesis in 50 chapters. From the very beginning to the family of Joseph, his sons going into Egypt. It's those several thousand years are in 50 chapters. With that being said, think of this. 25% of the book has to do with Joseph. When you look at it in that perspective, thinking, I just went through hundreds of years in Genesis 1 through 11, and then the story of Abraham starts in 12, and we've got Isaac, and then we've got Jacob, and then we have the birth of the first 10 sons. And now we have this 11th son being born, Joseph, and 14 of the last 15 chapters of the book of Genesis are about Joseph. So that should tell us immediately that the divine author and the human author are really highlighting this particular son. He's not the priestly son, that the priestly tribe, well, he's not Levi. He's not the son through whom the monarchy, the Davidic monarchy will come, and the Messiah, that's Judah. He's not that son. He is the firstborn son of Rachel, the favorite wife of Jacob. But he's not priestly, he's not royal. But what God and Moses are wanting us to see is that through this, the providential hand of God, but the heroic effort and sacrifice and endurance and godliness of the man Joseph, the entire people of God were saved from starvation. You know the story from Sunday school that the family is up in Israel and there is a famine and they need to go down to Egypt. What if years earlier Joseph had never made his way down there? Now, how he made his way down there was a circuitous route. You know, when he was only 17 years old, he was having these dreams, and he had a dream of his stalk standing up in the field and all the other stalks bowing down before it. Did not go over very well with his brothers. And he had another dream of the sun and the moon and the 12 stars, and he told that dream to his brothers, and that did not go over very well. That didn't even go over very well with his father. And so as he's telling these dreams, we read earlier in Genesis, I'm paraphrasing some of this, it says that they hated him yet the more for his words and for his dreams. But his dreams were 100% accurate. You know, wait a couple of decades and you'll see they'll be fulfilled. But they were 100% accurate. And you know the story of the two men in prison telling their dreams, and Joseph is able to interpret them, and through interpreting one of them, he gets elevated to a position close to Pharaoh, and then when Pharaoh, the leader of the land of Egypt, begins to have his series of dreams, and he's looking for someone to interpret, then a member of his court said, oh, my bad, I forgot. There is a man in prison that God shows the interpretation of dreams to. And so by this event happening, he is able to interpret the dreams of Pharaoh, saying there are going to be 7 plenteous years and 7 years of famine. And my recommendation during the years of plenty, store up and store up and store up and get ready for the 7 years of famine. And so because of this providential protection of this man, by the hand of God, he's able to save all of his brothers and sisters, his father. He's able to save the whole nation. The whole paradigm of promises to Abraham and Isaac would have disappeared if these people had disappeared. So this is God working behind the scenes. So the reason Joseph becomes so important, to answer your question, is this role he fulfills in saving the whole group of people. It will become a nation. It's not a nation now, but by saving everyone. So while he's in Egypt, I'm in Genesis 41. There were 2 sons born unto him. Verse 51 of Genesis 41, the firstborn was Manasseh. He said, God's made me to forget all my toil and all my father's house. They were long gone to him. Didn't think he'd ever see his father, his brothers, his family again. But he simply served God as faithfully as he could in the position in which he found himself. In verse 52, and the name of the second was Ephraim, for God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. And so many stories and so many parallels we can pull from that for our own lives. Be faithful to where God providentially has put us. And if you read the story of Joseph, he was a faithful man. He was tempted to commit adultery with his boss's wife. It would have probably been easy to do and get away with. But because he feared God above everything, he took off running rather than submit to a normal human temptation and sin. And just him fleeing from her caused him to be put in prison. That was the beginning of all of his problems, and he didn't do anything to cause it. But it was God's providential hand in control of everything to put him through a very circuitous route to be at the right hand of Pharaoh so that he could accomplish what God had planned for him to accomplish. And there are other passages in Genesis that we won't take time, but because he has 2 sons, and because 2 sons now come into the picture, look over in chapter 48. This is just a fascinating chapter that I may just paraphrase because it really does take up the entire chapter. But his father Jacob is old. Joseph wants his sons, Manasseh, the firstborn, and Ephraim, the younger, to be blessed by the father before he dies, because these patriarchal blessings were not just words at a birthday party. These held significance for them and for their descendants, for the rest of their life and even far beyond that. So he puts one son under his right hand and he puts his other son under his left hand, and he walks toward his father, knowing that his father would be in the opposite position to put his right hand, which is a hand of blessing, on the oldest and his left hand on the youngest. And what does his father do? He crosses his hands like this on purpose. Manasseh is the firstborn. So Manasseh would have been under Joseph's left hand as he pushed him forward to Jacob, so that Jacob's right hand would go on his head, and vice versa for Ephraim, the younger. But notice that this isn't unusual as far as the patriarchal narratives, because the elder brother many times wasn't the one. Think of Jacob and Esau. Think of that whole story. Think of Isaac and Ishmael. Think of the firstborn of Jacob's sons was Reuben. That's not the priestly tribe. That's not the messianic tribe. That's not the double portion tribe. So it's following the same pattern that we see with the other patriarchal narratives. But whenever he goes to push the sons, Jacob swaps and puts his right hand on the younger son and his left hand on the older son, and he knows exactly what he's doing. In verse 14, Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it upon Ephraim's head, who was the younger, and his left hand upon Manasseh's head, guiding his hands wittingly, for Manasseh was the firstborn. The author of the book wants us to keep in mind who is the firstborn, and that Jacob did this on purpose. And then he begins with this blessing. He blessed Joseph and said, God before whom my father Abraham and Isaac did walk, the God which fed me all my life long unto this day, the angel which redeemed me from evil, bless these lads. And let my name be named upon them in the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. And when Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on Ephraim, it displeased him. And he held up his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head unto Manasseh's head. And he said, not so, my father. But in verse 19, The father refused. He said, I know it, my son. I know it. He also shall become a people, and he shall be great, but truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his seed shall become a multitude of nations. And he blessed them that day, saying, In thee shall Israel bless thee, saying, God make thee as Ephraim and as Manasseh. And he set Ephraim before Manasseh. And then in verse 22, Moreover, I have given to thee one portion above thy brethren. Joseph, you're given a double portion in the persons of your two sons. So that's why we lost Levi, we have lost Joseph, and now we need to keep in our mind that those names, although they still do pop up in different lists for other reasons, the 12 tribes are counted with these two grandsons in mind. And let me just make one other point about how important Joseph was. He's so important that on many occasions in the Old Testament, it will refer to the nation as Joseph. We know it calls them Israel. And Israel, it always depends on the context. Keep this in mind. Israel can refer to the northern and southern kingdom. It can refer to all of them before the kingdoms were divided. It can refer to all of them after the kingdoms went into captivity. But it also can refer to Israel, the northern kingdom, and Judah, the southern kingdom. But look how important Joseph's name can be as a reference to the entire northern kingdom just by one son. This is in Amos 5 and verse 6. You have to find these little prophecies, and Amos happens to be a prophet who is from Judah. He's from the south. The kingdom has split. He's from the south. But he is sent to prophesy to the northern kingdom. I hope I have the right verse. Yeah, Amos 5:6. Seek the Lord and ye shall live. Remember, he's talking to the northern kingdom of Israel, that is normally called Israel, lest he break out like fire in the house of Joseph, and devour it, and there be none to quench it in Bethel, which was one of the idolatrous cities up in the northern kingdom. And the same can be seen in chapter 6 and verse 6, where simply by the use of the name Joseph, he is referring to the entire northern kingdom. It's also true in Obadiah 18. A passage you would want to look at is Ezekiel 37:16. This is a part of Ezekiel's sign prophecies where he has these two sticks. Because the kingdom has been divided, he's going to join these sticks. And that is a sign prophecy of the eventual reunification of the nation at a future time, because that has never happened since Ezekiel's time. In Ezekiel 37:16, Moreover, thou son of man, take one stick and write upon it Judah, and take another stick for Joseph. So he's using Judah as a reference to the southern kingdom and Joseph as a reference to the northern kingdom. And one final verse, Zechariah 10:6, makes it probably more obvious or clearer than any of these. Zechariah chapter 10 and verse 6, where you're going to see both of the kingdoms, and they're referred to the northern one under Joseph's name. Just to show you the importance of Joseph, that he did receive a double portion. And that's why in a lot of the later lists of tribes in the Old Testament, you don't see Joseph, you see Ephraim and Manasseh. And this is going to get us eventually, starting next time we're together, back to Revelation 7, because we have one of those sons, Manasseh, mentioned. We don't have the other one mentioned, and we'll talk about the whys and wherefores when we get there. Zechariah 10:6, I will strengthen. Again, this is a future eschatological prophecy. Zechariah, God is speaking through him. He said, I'll strengthen the house of Judah, that's the southern kingdom, and I will save the house of Joseph, that's the northern kingdom. If you look at this which I've given you before. Here's Ephraim and Manasseh, half tribe, and the other half tribe. They're all a part of the northern kingdom. Ephraim and Manasseh are a part of the northern kingdom.
These were the land boundaries given to the land. To
Yes.
the tribes.
And speaking of the land boundaries, let's talk about that for a few moments. Let's go in our Bible and in our mind back to the book of Joshua. Once they have, and I know I give you guys probably more than you ask for, but I just want to make sure that it is complete and thorough enough that if you don't catch everything I'm saying now, you can always go back and listen to this. Listen to a teaching to see now, what did he say there? Because I just know so many people just read the Bible devotionally and they want to see, what is God saying to me today? But many times we're going to miss what the historical narrative is all about and what the author was really trying to communicate. And so I know when you're reading the Pentateuch, that's the first 5 books of Moses, you get out of Genesis, you get into Exodus, and you know, I remember the Red Sea, I remember that story, and then you kind of get lost in the minutiae. So what is happening, what is happening in the minutiae is this map.
The wanderings.
The second half of Exodus, just to kind of summarize this, the second half of Exodus have the 10 Commandments, the erection of the tabernacle, just various things happening. Exodus, Leviticus, by name, that's Levitical laws given for the tribe of Levi and for the priestly part of that tribe. Numbers, that's why I've given you all these numbers. If you go back to this third and fourth column, look, preparation for travel. So they're through with all of the deeds and things that need to be discussed as soon as they've come out of Egypt. Now, guess what it's time for? We're going into the promised land. So they're all organized and they're getting ready to march. And that's what they do. And they begin to march. So all of this going down into the Sinai Peninsula, they're through with all of that. That takes up 18 to 24 months. So when you read in the Bible that they wandered for 40 years, that's kind of a general term. They really only wandered for 38. The first 2 years were spent going down to Mount Sinai, receiving all the law, etc. Now that they have that, as you see this map, they march right up to a famous place called Kadesh Barnea. You see it all in the book of Numbers. They're up in Kadesh Barnea. That's the little town, Kadesh Barnea, from which Moses sent the spies out. God had said, send spies out. That's in Numbers 13. And by the way, Numbers 13 is another one of those chapters that will give you one of those 20 lists of the Old Testament tribes. And I don't even know what the order is, but I can absolutely guarantee you without even turning there, it won't be the same as any of these others that we've looked at. But Numbers 13, God said, take a chief man, representative of each of the 12 tribes, and go into the land and describe it, and then the people are going to go in and take it over. But you know the story. 10 spies came back saying, there's no way we can do this. They had just crossed the Red Sea. All of Pharaoh's host had been killed. God had delivered them with 10 great plagues, concluding with the death of the firstborn. When, as we read last time in Exodus 4, God told Moses, go tell Pharaoh, Israel is my child, he is my firstborn son, let him go. And if you don't let him go, I will kill your firstborn. That's in Exodus 4. And that's exactly what Pharaoh didn't do and what God did do.
Yeah, I have a point. This
Yes.
is one of the great places in Scripture, along with Jesus' ministry, where we have proof that you give humans miracles, they still won't believe God. Miracles won't make you believe.
Yeah.
They won't make you believe.
Yeah, they asked
Because
for
they're miracles, they did not believe in.
They asked for a sign in Jesus' day, and he gave signs to some people who asked for a sign. He said, the only sign I'm going to give you is the sign of Jonah, and that is death, burial, and resurrection. That's the sign you need, because all of these miracles won't do you any good. Because the people are unregenerate. People have this funny notion in their mind. They think, well, these are the people of God. Externally, they are. They are the chosen nation. But not all Israel is Israel, Paul said in Romans. They are externally the nation of God. But there are not very many regenerate people among them. Look at Christendom today, how big Christendom is. And if you want to include Roman Catholicism, which I wouldn't, but some people would, there are billions of Christians, right? I doubt it. And why do I say that? Because Jesus was asked by his disciples, how many are going to make it in? And he said, few there will be that find entrance into the kingdom of heaven. The way going down below is broad. It's a big door and it's a broad path. So yes, externally, and I'm happy for the external positive influences in Europe and in the United States that Christianity has brought. It has brought positive external, but a man must be born again to see the kingdom of God. You know, you can have a lot of good things. If you have the Bible and the Ten Commandments and Christian people, then, you know, you tend toward labor laws that are good, housing laws that are good. You just tend toward good things that you want to treat people fairly. But at the end of the day, none of that amounts to anything. You're either a believer or an unbeliever. And you're either going up, you know, just to use the spatial terminology, or you're going down. So here they are in Kadesh Barnea. They're supposed to go into the promised land. They come back with 10 spies and a negative report. And after all these miracles, God has been patient so long, then he says to Moses, says to the people through Moses, these people, their carcasses will die in the wilderness. And only Caleb and Joshua, above those above the age of 20, will go in, and Caleb and Joshua do, and we get the book of Joshua from that, and the rest of these will perish. So what happens is they just do a lot of wandering around for 38 years. So just a mental note, or you can write it in your Bible, between Numbers, and you can find this by looking at their chronology, between Numbers 19 and 20, between those two chapters, is a 38-year gap. Is a 38-year gap. So when we get to the end of Numbers, now they are beginning to make their final march. We're 38 years after the fiasco at Kadesh Barnea. And now they're all the way around here on the east side of the promised land, and Joshua is getting ready to do what all military tacticians have done in the past, and that is divide and conquer. It's probably wonderfully providential that they didn't try to attack from Kadesh Barnea, because you have the full height or length of the land to go through. And so rather than do that, they're going to cross the Jordan River just above the Dead Sea and attack Jericho. As you know, the famous story of Jericho. So by Joshua splitting this wedge into the middle of the country, he's going to separate any kings and peoples from the north from being able to ally and succor the people from the south, and vice versa. So he'll go right in the heart of the promised land, and then they will defeat people left and right of them. While they are in this area east of Jordan, which we call Transjordan, even when Moses was still alive, as you can see from this map, there were 2.5 tribes that had so many cattle. This is a fertile land. It's on the east side of the Jordan River, lots of grazing. And they asked Moses, could we please just have our inheritance here? Reuben, Gad, and about half of the population of the big tribe of Manasseh. And Moses was angry to begin with. He was afraid that they would get all settled down and they wouldn't when it's time to go across the river and fight for their brethren to obtain their land, that they wouldn't do it. They promised that they would. And guess what? That's exactly what they did. They left their flocks and herds and some soldiers and their women and children. And when it was time for the 9.5 tribes to go across Jordan, they all went together. And so starting in this is going to be a little quick summary. You don't have to write all this down. I'm going to wrap this up with some interesting comments at the end, hopefully. But starting in Joshua 12, the first half, Joshua's like divided in half. The first 11 chapters are these individual battles. Remember Jericho, remember Rahab, the harlot who housed the spies, and because of her faithfulness, the Messiah, she's an ancestress of the Messiah, of Jesus Christ, because she believed these spies said, you are servants of the living God. She's a pagan living in a pagan city called Jericho, but because she preserves their life, it was life for her life. They said, hang that scarlet thread or rope or cord out of your window, and when we attack this city, and as God lives in heaven, we will attack this city, and we'll kill everyone here, and we will spare you.
And her family.
And her family, and that's exactly what happens. So early in Joshua, this is what you see, city by city by city. Jericho, Ai, the Gibeonites, some other people, they're right in the heart of the promised land. That's what takes place in the first half of the book. The second half of the book, guess what it's about? It is about land allotment. So in chapter 12, you have a very basic preliminary description of what had been divided in Transjordan, that's over on the east side, and what was still to be divided in what we would call Israel proper. And it's interesting as you read Joshua, because you just think they just went in there and did it. It's not the way that it happened. There were all kinds of delays. There were all kinds of skirmishes. The tribes were never united under God as they should have been. They were never united under Moses. So you know they're not going to be united under God. So they have all of their problems and all of their setbacks. And so by the time we get to Joshua 13 and verse 1, I think this is telling us, hey, he's getting ready to die. Look at Joshua 13:1. Joshua was old and stricken in years, and the Lord said, thou art old and stricken in years, and there remaineth yet very much land to be possessed. So that's what the rest of the book of Joshua is about. It is the actual land allotment or the dividing up. And I'm just going to give this to you real quickly. In Joshua 14, we see Levi is excluded. We've already talked about that before. And in his place, we have Joseph, and in his place, we have his two sons. In chapters 15 through 17, I'm not going to read any of this, but this would help you as you read the book if you understand how all of this ties together. We have the division of the land for Judah and for Ephraim and for that other half of Manasseh. And then look at the comment in 18:2, in Joshua 18:2. There remained among the children of Israel 7 tribes which still did not have their inheritance. So that would be the other 7. And so in chapters 18 and 19, you have Benjamin in this order, then Simeon, then Zebulun, then Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan.
Yeah, am I correct in interpreting? As I'm reading Joshua, they would cast the holy
The lots.
the lot. They're two dice. Basically, for lack of a better, it's like 2 dice. Right?
Yes.
They would cast that, and God had promised that miraculously He would be behind the casting of that, and they could trust in whatever the result would be.
He did. Oh, we have 3 neighbors.
And so they would cast that before even possessing any land. They would pick out some land on the map. They would cast a lot, and for this particular land that hasn't been conquered yet, and they would say, "That's going to you. Now let's go conquer it." They didn't conquer all the land and then cast as He would. They cast before they went to conquer. Is that right?
That's correct.
That's what I thought.
So the sacred lot, and we don't know exactly how that worked, but there were these 2 die, as we say, as you say, lots.
The Urim and the Tumim.
Yes, that the high priest kept on his heart. And so by casting of the lots, well, first of all, remember they had spied out the land. So they don't have modern methods of surveying and dividing property. They don't have longitude and latitude. So what they would do, and if you read the account, you will see this. You will definitely see this, but it's rather tedious. But just try to think of it in the big picture. They did a lot of their dividing based on water, because water was terribly important in the Middle East. So you have this big body of water, and it's talked about. So anybody touching this body of water, the Mediterranean, that would be their western boundary. They have these bodies of water, the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, and the Dead Sea, and they're mentioned in the description. And then you have various rivers or springs that flow regularly through the land. So as the spies are going through the land, they're very intelligent people. These aren't cavemen or Cro-Magnon men or something just because they don't have surveying tools. They're very intelligent people who can remember where they were, and they've written down based on water, based on mountains, based on incredibly large plains like the plain of Jezreel, or also it's called in Greek Esdraelon, which is where Megiddo is, which we'll talk about Armageddon in Revelation 16:16. That's up in the northern part of Israel. They would have old cities that they were yet to conquer, or maybe ones that had already been conquered by somebody else. So there were various, in other words, landmarks that they could use. So they would specify all of this. We don't know all the mechanics involved, but yes, the lots would be cast. As Proverbs said, the lot is cast into the lap, but the whole disposing thereof is of the Lord. That he supernaturally controlled it so that each tribe got what they were supposed to get.
Didn't God say in Leviticus through Moses giving of the law that if the high priest has those Urim and Turim, and if he cast that in the sight of people, didn't he promise that he would be miraculously would control the outcome, and you can trust whatever the outcome is.
Yes.
That's what I determined.
And no one fought over that. The people knew that. No one said, I don't think. They might have been unhappy with
The outcome.
Well, they were unhappy. Dan, for instance, which we've talked about before. Dan is unhappy because this is a mountainous area, and there are a lot of people that they just can't seem to overcome. They couldn't. God said, go in and wipe the enemy out, and the land is yours. And you say, well, how do they do that? They had to do that by faith. The same way they come out of Egypt, the same way they attacked Jericho. They were always outnumbered militarily. But God said, it's not in horses and chariots, it's in my name and under my authority that you will be given the victory and be able to possess the land.
So they were scared. They wouldn't go start the fight.
Yeah,
They
just go fight. How did they overcome Jericho? Miraculously. Yes, they were not willing to go in, and so Dan then ends up with, some territory way up here to the north, which we've talked about before, and we'll talk about some more because Dan happens to be that one of two missing tribes in Revelation 7 that generates all the heat and electricity when it comes to the 144,000. So let me just end by saying this, because I want all of you to understand the importance of the book of Joshua, the seriousness. It's a historical narrative. And the historical narrative is 100% factual, 100% true. If it said the sun stood still and the moon didn't hasten to go down until Joshua and the nation were avenged of their enemies, as it does in Joshua 10, that's exactly what happened. If it said the walls of Jericho just fell down after they marched around and gave the shout, then that's exactly what happened. But there's more than that there. There are spiritual and theological lessons for us, but definitely for the nation of Israel. So I would say it like this. This is a really important statement that I would like for you to maybe get a hold of. The allotment the division and the allotment. So this is the book of Joshua. The allotment of the tribal territories was the second most important historical event for the nation, second only to the Exodus. The Exodus is what made them the nation of Israel. They were just a group of slaves down there. God brought them out. And when you read the Psalms and the later prophets, do they not make constant reference to remember the Lord that brought you out of the land of Egypt? That was supposed to be not just a historical event, but something that was deeply theologically meaningful and spiritually meaningful. That if God did that for us, for our forefathers, surely He will take care of us today. And the second thing, second only to the Exodus in importance, was the allotment of the lands. Because think about it. Had God delivered them from Egypt and never brought them into their inheritance, what was the point of the Exodus? He would have failed in all His promises to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob had He not successfully brought them into this land. So this is not just Joshua and Judges, just old books about all these battles and all these peoples. It was deeply theological and it was deeply spiritual for the people. And they felt that way for they were supposed to feel that way forever. And the righteous members of the nation did feel that way. The righteous members of the nation, look at this really unusual passage in Psalm 16 that you might have never thought of like this, but maybe you will look at it in a new light. They saw spiritual significance in God's faithfulness to keep His promises, and that is land promises. The land promises, I've harped on this before we even got to this, are just hugely important in the Old Testament. They were under the Old Covenant, and they lost their land in Babylonian captivity and in the Roman dispersion, but the prophets with one voice have all said, what God said to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is still true. He's going to bring you back to your land. He's brought them back before. He'll bring them back again. In Psalm 16, this is a psalm of David in verses 5 and 6. He says, the Lord is the portion of mine inheritance. You say, we're getting there. You wouldn't know he's talking about tribal allotments yet until you just keep reading, because inheritance could mean some kind of something else. The Lord is a portion of mine inheritance and of my cup. Thou maintainest my lot. The lines, L-I-N-E-S, are fallen unto me in pleasant places. Yea, I have a goodly heritage. There was pure joy and happiness in the godly Israelites over the land that God had given them. There was pure joy and happiness, and this is expressed in maybe a not so easy to identify passage where we would just tend to spiritualize it, but where the spiritual believers of the Old Testament took very seriously the land that God had given them. And I thought of it like this. This is one way I could also share this with 21st century Western American evangelical Christians, where guess what? Land doesn't really mean much to us. Land does not mean to us what it has meant to most people down through history. Take the American Indians. When we came over here, what we now call the United States was just a vast land from sea to shining sea, controlled by all different kinds of Indian tribes. And it was incredibly important to them. And it was the death knell of all of the Indians to take them off of their what? Their land. Their land. Now, it wasn't by divine lot as Israel's was, but it was still their land that had been their land for centuries. To take that land away from them and to put them on what we call a reservation. And that was basically the end of the American Indian. When they lost their land, they lost their identity. And so for us today, as Americans, we tend to think of, well, inheritance would be, Memal's priceless china, or, memorabilia, things that we have a nostalgic attachment to, or even better, money. For America, inheritance is what? Inheritance is just money. That's all it is. Oh, cold, hard, dirty, filthy cash. It's just money. But that's not the way it was for Israel. The most important inheritance for an Israelite was his tribal allotment. It meant everything to him. And it confirmed in his mind the fact that God is faithful. God who brought us out and said he would bring us in, he did exactly that. And I would like to suggest for us tonight, in closing, that besides this literal and historical nature and value of all of this, as I intimated earlier this evening, I think, and I've always thought, and I will always think, that don't tamper with the history of it. It's all history, needs to be studied and understood. But as you're reading Joshua, you're supposed to ask yourself, what's the point? So I know about Jericho, so I know about Ai. What's the point? The point is, there are probably eternal stories and messages being told to us there. I'm going to read one paragraph out of Woodstra's commentary on Joshua that I thought was so appropriate for where we are tonight. It reads like this. Listen, it's a little short paragraph. The events recorded in the first part of Joshua form a prelude to and that's chapters 1 through 11, to a more final victory that God will win over Israel's enemies. And at a future time, much future from even the book of Joshua, God will purge the world of those who have refused to accept him as Lord, and will give their territory to his people as their inheritance forever. Matthew 5:5, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth.
If that's not a literal promise, I don't know what spiritual meaning.
God displaced those pagans who would not bow the knee to Yahweh and moved his people in their place. And as I think the book in a bigger narrative is telling us, and as Matthew 5 tells us, and I'm going to conclude with a passage over in book of Psalms, since we're still there. Look at Psalm 37. Look at Psalm 37:9. Here we have some eternal spiritual principles from the psalmist. I always encourage everyone, as you read the Bible, just realize that even if it seems to be some of the most tedious stuff, learn the tedious stuff, because you won't know anything if you don't understand what the author is trying to tell you by the conquest of Canaan. But always tell yourself, there may be something else here. What's the bigger picture? I've got the history. What's the bigger picture here? Psalm 37 and verse 9. Evildoers shall be cut off. That's Jericho, Ai, that's all those Canaanites and Amalekites and Jebusites and Perizzites and Girgasites, everybody but the termites and the Israelites. Everybody but them, they are going to be cut off, and they were cut off. But those that wait upon the Lord, they will inherit the earth. Which is a millennial prediction. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth.
It is simple to trust in Jesus, just to take him at his word. He's a faithful God of heaven, and he's conquered us on earth. And Amen.